Hey guys, happy Tuesday. I'm here live for our weekly Q&A session. This is actually the first that I'll be doing, and every week I'll come live on Tuesdays, usually around 3 p.m. Pacific. But we'll kind of see based off this kids' schedules how this works out. So today I am talking about one of my favorite topics, one that I get asked about all the time. So let me go back a little bit. About 10 years ago, I started presenting in the corporate world on stages where I had the opportunity to teach a lot about customer service and just teamwork in businesses. And quite frankly, I was really young at the time and I didn't have a ton of experience, but I did have some experience. And I had a lot of stories that I could share about small businesses that I had worked in previously. And I found myself telling those stories to my audiences to teach the content that I had. And it came pretty naturally. And over the years, I've been able to tell more and more stories to prove or to make my point in my content. And it's become one of my signature styles when it comes to presenting. So I have people ask me all the time, how do they successfully incorporate storytelling into their teaching or their training? And I have a few tips and recipes that I'll share with you today. But thank you for those of you who sent your questions in. I got them from Instagram, direct messages, and I got quite a few emails in response to my weekly email. So I'm going to hit those today. And of course, if you're not catching this live, but you're getting the recording later, please drop any questions that you have in the comment box below, and I'll answer those on an upcoming Q&A maybe next week. So let's jump in. The first question that I got in my inbox was, Heather, when's the best place to tell a story in my presentation? And this is a question where there are so many different answers, and you can tell them in the beginning or in the middle or the end. You really can't go wrong with telling a story, but there is a very strategic place that I always recommend that you launch a story. And that is right before you want to teach something that you want people to remember, or right before you want to teach the most important piece of content that you have that you'll be delivering. You want to tell a story. And that essentially it's your ability to capture someone's attention. Because here's the thing when it comes to presenting is your audience is going to waver in and out on their attentiveness to you. People are not going to be hanging on to every single word that you have to say. Let's be honest, we all get distracted. We might need to check our cell phones or run to the bathroom, or we're thinking about what we're going to have for dinner tonight. We're not engaged in every single moment. So what you want to do is right before you make a really profound point or a really important lesson, you want to tell a story. And that essentially is your way of doing kind of one of these to your audience to say, look at me. Pay attention, what's coming next is really important. So you want to tell a story right before you deliver an important piece of content. And that is what I would say is always the best place to put your story. Second question that came in is, Heather, how long should stories be? I've heard really long ones, I've heard short ones, they've both been successful. Is there a secret recipe around how long? This is a really good question. And I think it really varies. So I like to look at storytelling. Imagine you're at a park with a teeter-totter, and you have one side is telling the story, and the other side is the lesson or the point that you were trying to make. And you really have to think about the balance of the two. So you don't want to tell a really, really long story for a pretty unsubstantial point. You want them to balance out a bit. So if you're going to share a long story, let's say your story is 5 minutes, which in the world of presenting, that's a really long story. If it's 5 minutes, you sure as heck better make sure that you have a really, really significant point. And by significant point, I mean some kind of lesson or teaching or value that really is going to pay off to your audience. It has to be valuable for them, where ultimately they feel that the payoff of their time of listening to your story, really there's a payoff by what they benefited from, what they learned from you. So how long should a story be? It could be as short as 10 to 15 seconds to make kind of a clear, quick point, or it could be 2 to 3 minutes or longer if your lesson or teaching coming after that is really substantive and there is a high payoff for your audience. Okay, so that's how long. What should my stories be about? I work in business, but I hear a lot of people tell personal stories in their presentations. Can you tell personal stories in business? That's a really good question. That one came from Instagram. On that one there, I would say when it comes to your stories, you really have to think about what the point of your story is. I love it when people tell stories that are totally and completely abstract, meaning that they really don't have anything to do with the topic that you're discussing. But when you circle to the end of the story and the point becomes clear, there's a really clear connection between why you told the story and what the audience is going to learn from you. So I think personal stories, I think telling examples of something that you saw on television last night, or it could be business stories of examples of your clients of things that they have done before. So, I mean, they can be in the same lane of the point you're making or totally on a completely different freeway. What it comes down to is what's the point of the story. And that's what I usually call the bridge. You have your story, you have your content that you teach, and then you have the bridge that pulls the two things together. As long as that bridge is extremely clear, I mean, I would say there's not a lot of stories that are out of bounds. As long as it makes sense and it's keeping your audience in mind, I think personal stories are totally appropriate in business. Again, as long as the bridge or the point of the story really has a direct connection to what you're going to teach them. Okay, that was a great question there. I'm going to give you a couple tips. There's a couple other questions, but I kind of ahead of myself and answered a lot of them. So what we'll do is I'll go ahead and wrap up today by giving you my 3 best tips for storytelling. So as you think about how to integrate stories into your next presentation, you can kind of keep these in the back of your mind. So tip number 1, that is you actually have to tell the story. Now this might seem super obvious, but so many times I watch presenters talk about something that happened with them, about it happened to them, but they don't actually tell the story. So for example, I could say, you know, yesterday I went to the grocery store and I totally had a weird thing happen where I ran my cart into one of those in displays in an aisle and it was really awkward. I mean, it's funny. I ran my cart into an end display in an aisle. Side note, this isn't really a true story. I'm just making this up as I go. But I mean, the story is just kind of like, I ran my car into the end of an aisle and then it's done. You actually want to tell the story. Like you're sitting at happy hour with one of your girlfriends and you're telling them about something that happened to you. You'd get into the details. So you'd say, all right, girlfriend, yesterday, you're not going to believe this. I was at the grocery store and I was shopping and I had both kids with me and I was using one of those silly apps on my phone, you know, to keep track of all the lists. I needed toilet paper, I needed vitamins and pork supplies. I don't know. I had all the specifics on my list, and I was roaming up and down the aisles with baby on my hip because he wouldn't stay in the shopping cart. My toddler was draped off the side of the cart, and we were going through, and I was picking up the rice and I was picking up pasta. And I come around the aisle and I'm trying to hold the baby and steer the cart, and I'm looking down at my list to see what I needed from the produce aisle. And I don't know how, but the 4-year-old managed to push the cart right outside of my grasp, and the cart went straight for this giant pineapple display, and it hit it, and the pineapples and everything went everywhere. And here I am with the baby in my arm and the cell phone in my hand, and all those people staring at me going, this dumb mom, like text messaging on her phone or working on Facebook, is not paying attention to her kid and is totally the terrible mom in history. Again, none of this was true. I just made it up, but you get the idea that you actually, if you're going to tell a story, you got to tell it. You got to include the details. You have to draw the listener in so they can pretend that they're actually there with you, that they can imagine what it would feel like to have this crazy thing happen to them and then be mom shamed in a grocery store for being on a cell phone. I mean, again, it didn't happen, but I totally imagine it could happen to me. But the point is, you have to actually tell the story. If you're going to include a story, tell it and make sure that you actually are describing what's going on around you. And I always recommend practice your stories and tell them to someone. And if they can actually tell the story back to you, you've done a good job. But if they can't describe the story back to you, you're not actually telling it. So that's tip number 1, tell the story. Tip number 2 is where to get your stories. I have people tell me all the time, Heather, you have all these really great stories to share. I don't have any. And that's total, I mean, that's crap. You have so many stories. You just have to think about ones that you actually can use. So if you have a hard time coming up with a story, you also can borrow stories from other people. And I think this is a really great way, especially if you're newer at presenting or newer at incorporating stories into your presentations, borrow a story. And a great way that I like to use these is, I mentioned this before, reference a television show that you saw or a story that you read in a book. Make sure to give it credit. Don't pretend like that thing happened to you. But say, you know, last night I was watching Food Network. It's one of my absolute favorite shows. And there's this competition with kids that they're baking. It's like a kids baking championship. And then launch into the story about what happened on the episode. That's storytelling. It's okay that it's not your story, but you're telling a story of something that you witnessed. Just make sure that you set it up, again, of someone else's story. So your story, if you don't have any that you can think of off the top of your mind, tip number 2 is borrow a story. Just be sure to give them credit. And then tip number 3, I think this goes into any time you tell a story, you have to make sure there's a point. You should never tell a story to any audience without making sure that your point is really, really clear. And if you can't answer the question, what's the point of the story? You shouldn't be telling it. Now, again, this seems pretty obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I've had people in my workshops tell me, oh my God, I have this really incredible story that I want to share in my next presentation. And then I ask them, perfect, so what's the lesson of your story? And they're like, I don't know, I'm trying to figure that part out. No, just no. You can't start with a story and then figure out what lesson you're going to teach people. That's totally backwards. That's putting the focus on you and your story and your ego, quite frankly. So what you have to focus on first is, what am I trying to teach my audience? What do they need to know? Where are they at right now and how can I serve them? And then think about what lessons that you have that you can give them. And think about, okay, so based off of what I want to teach them, what stories can I share that exhibit that point? So you always want to start with the lessons and the point of the story before, or of your talk, before you ever approach the topic around what story to tell. And I know this is extremely hard because if you're anything like me, you have a lot of really great stories, a lot of funny stories that you want to share with your audience, and you know you can figure out a way on how to weave them in. But I caution you, take a pause, step back for just a second, and really ask yourself, what's the point of the story that I'm trying to share? And really, is there a bigger message here that I'm super clear on? And is there a better way that I can set it up and a better way that I can tell it? So it's a little bit about storytelling. I hope these tips and also these answers to the questions that came in, I hope you find them helpful. And if you have any questions around giving presentations, doing a keynote speech, engaging with an audience or asking questions, whether it's live in a workshop or live on Facebook, shoot your questions either below in the comments, shoot me a direct message, or follow me where I hang out every day over on Instagram at the Heather Sager. I hope you guys have a great week. If you're in the Pacific Northwest, I hope you enjoy what's left of the snow apocalypse of 2019. And we'll see you soon. Bye, guys.